Now, the disability movement are very concerned about any moves to change the law. And Jane Campbell, who's featured here, has got advanced spinal muscular atrophy. She is now in the House of Lords. When she was 2, her mother was told that she probably would die within a couple of years, but at most would live to 7. She's now 50. I went to her 50th birthday party. She's probably done more for disability in this country than anybody else. She's set up all of the dial-a-ride and the disability support, independent living, and so on. And there's a whole group of people with really severe disability. And the reason that they are so worried about this is that they know how difficult it is to get treated as they should be treated without people making value judgments, without saying, oh, it must be awful to be like that. You know, Jane can do nothing for herself, but she can think, and she can dictate using voice recognition software, and she makes astounding speeches, and she certainly gets people moving. And she says, fine, you can do the running around. She's got a very, very sensitive button on her electric wheelchair. I mean, if one time I pressed it and she kind of went whizzing off, it's because she's got very little movement, but she needs everything. She needs all her care doing for her. But she says, that's fine, I'm used to it. People are helping her and she's helping other people, and she has a really important role in life. And they feel that they fight to be treated. When she was last in intensive care, there were 2 consultants who said, well, there won't be any point putting you on a ventilator now because we won't get you off again. And she and her husband had to pressurize for her to be treated. And she kept herself awake for 2 days on a ventilator because she was frightened that if she went to sleep, they would turn the ventilator off. The only time that she had confidence is when her husband was awake at her side, or her sister. Now, she's now being treated really well. That should not happen to anybody, but people with severe disability find all the time value judgments are being made about them, and a sense that somehow, well, you know, they've gone on for so long and they've outlived their expectation and this is the time for them to go. And one of the people with disability was meant to come to a meeting that Jane organised a couple of weeks ago. And she sent this email through because she couldn't come because she'd got a chest infection. And she's somebody who's ventilator dependent at night. And this is a direct quote from her email that landed in my emails that morning. My biggest fear is that somebody will use the opportunity to decide that I would be better off not being treated and to let nature take its course. And that was her fear, and we were having a meeting with many people with severe disability there, but she couldn't come. And I just thought that said it all, really. Now, what about the Terry Pratchett scenario? How many of you saw Terry Pratchett's lecture? Yeah, quite a few of you. And he was asking for death on request by committee, but there was a paradigm shift in there, because up until then, all the arguments had been around people with severe physical illness but with mental capacity. But all of a sudden, here's somebody physically strong but losing mental capacity saying, well, sometime down the road, to be decided, somebody will decide when to bump me off. But when? And how do you decide that he is now that frail that he ought to be bumped off? And how do you check out that he still wants to be bumped off? Because the experience of looking after people with advancing dementia is that those around them might find it difficult, but the person themselves often isn't repeatedly asking to die, even if they have earlier on. So there's a whole consent issue, and it's a pretty major thing to go and end somebody's life, particularly if you do it without their consent. And I just wonder whether the so-called choice agenda really should include death by appointment, or is that too dangerous a road to go down? And what are the choices? Because actually, when people are ill, the choice that they want to have is the one that they can't have, which is to not be ill. Anybody who's ill doesn't want to be ill. So that's the real choice that they want. So all the rest are kind of second-rate choices, if you like, in terms of what treatment do you have, or this or that or the other. And they need to be weighed up and they need to be discussed. And sometimes there isn't any great choice in there. And most of the time there isn't any great choice. So I'd sometimes worry too that we're almost deceiving people by pretending that people who are ill have a whole range of choices, because actually usually there is for them a best treatment. And quite often the other choice may be no treatment, but of course that has consequences too that they need to go through and understand. But I don't think death was easier in the old days, because we didn't know what we were doing. When I qualified, we didn't know how to control pain. And I look back with shame and horror at the way that we failed patients when I first qualified, because we didn't understand how morphine works, we didn't understand what to do. So there were really big problems then. But sadly, the relatives of those patients who died then have got those memories emblazoned on their memory, just as I remember some of them very clearly, and we just didn't have a clue, really, compared to where we are now. Now, the Suicide Act was amended and says that suicide is not illegal, but assisting or encouraging is. And Section 4 is what happens if there is a prosecution and a sentence. And I've only put this in because I just want to draw your attention to the fact that it is up to a maximum of 14 years. But just about nobody has had a sentence of 14 years. And it may be a conditional discharge. And indeed, most sentences are, because we've got enough people in prison already without imprisoning somebody who's assisted somebody else's suicide. And they've done it out of good intention most of the time. One hopes that's how they've done it. So the Director of Public Prosecutions, as you may remember, was asked to produce guidelines on whether to prosecute or not. And that was the largest consultation nationally. There were almost 5,000 responses to that consultation. And in his final version, he's come out with 16 pointers towards prosecution. And what those are, the key ones I think that I wanted to highlight are that if you repeatedly assist suicides, you are a serial assister, you're more likely to be prosecuted. And that if you do it in your capacity as a doctor or nurse or somebody looking after the patient. So if you, as a doctor, say, well, actually, I'll give you a prescription and you can stockpile these drugs in an 8 weeks' time, if you take the lot all in one go, you're pretty certain to kill yourself, then that would particularly lead towards prosecution, because it would be abuse of the position of trust that you're in as a doctor. So I think those are quite important. And the factors against prosecution are also important. But the one that was most important was the one that he took out. And that was that in his initial draft, he had included a factor against prosecution was that the victim had a terminal illness or severe or incurable physical disability or severe degenerative physical condition from which there is no possibility of recovery. And I think it was the voice of those with severe disability that actually was listened to. Because by having that in there, it was saying that the law, which is there to protect people, because the law has a protective function, that protection is less if you happen to be severely ill or disabled. So it was saying that actually if you're severely ill or disabled, you're a second-class citizen. You do not deserve equal protection in law. And going back to the Dr. Martin scenario, one of my worries there, of the many, relates to the protection that the law should give to people.